Tuesday, November 27th. Welcome to the Matt Sager Podcast. And I'm very sorry that I ran a repeat last night. Had no other choice. Somehow Friday's show got corrupted, and I spent the whole weekend trying to set up conversations with all of my podcast hosts and the various platforms that syndicate my podcast. And I want to stress, the only emotion I have is gratitude for the many platforms on which I'm allowed to host my podcast. But several of them somehow received a corrupt file in place of the episode I recorded, and I just couldn't make it work. So ultimately, I just had to take the whole show down and took the opportunity yesterday to re-upload it, thinking, well, both of these are sort of the episode after Thanksgiving. The original was recorded on and was about Black Friday, and it ultimately aired again on Cyber Monday, which, really, these 2 days are very similar. You're still coming out of the whole Thanksgiving hangover. There's tons of deals online that you're trying to control yourself from spending all your credit card money on. Sometimes shit happens, So for continuity's sake, I just removed the bad file so that no one could have access to it and just re-uploaded with an explanation. One which I hope is satisfactory for you, and if not, I cry thy pardon, sirrah. So, I am going to be the bigger man. This is not a sentence you'll hear from me very often. But a couple of times last week, and at least 2 episodes of the Matt Sager Podcast, I kind of let my feelings about Bill Maher get the better of me. He, in an obvious plea for attention, said hateful, awful things about Stan Lee in the wake of his passing, which I thought was just the most despicable, hateful, just vile, and really sad cry for attention from the desperately irrelevant, unfunny, uninteresting, other than a self-inflicted catastrophe, Bill Maher. Just a loser who was not worth my time, and neither is this podcast, which I'm not going to reference. Hosted by, I've spoken in the past on this show about one of the reasons I don't go in too heavy on the rather poor podcasts of Westwood One. One of the reasons being that I worked with them as an intern and then later as a producer, and that they approached me close to a year ago with an offer to co-host a podcast on their network. And ultimately, because of the co-host involved, who I generally think of as a good guy, when possible, and who I certainly didn't want to name or call out or embarrass, but his inability to control himself, his substance abuse issues, mood issues, anarchic, chaotic inability to string a sentence together on the air, I just, in the nicest way possible, said, listen, I'm sorry, we can't do this. And then he got really, really angry. And for what it's worth, not only do I still like the guy, although he clearly does not feel the same way about me, I relate to all these things. I relate to these really strong emotions where you either love someone like intensely, like a brother, or there's a spat and now you hate them and you want them dead. I'm happy to say that through self-examination and meditation and just growing up, this guy and I have been friends since we were like 18. And in many ways, we're that same person. But I like to think that along the way, I've gathered some bruises and scrapes here and there, but I've also gained a little bit of maturity and a little bit of self-awareness. So I'm aware that I've suffered from the exact same flaws I'm calling out on in him. And I like to think that I've beaten them, that I've overcome them. What was more surprising than this gentleman calling me by name and saying some really, really shocking things about me, some that were true, some that are untrue, some that are out of context, and some that were, if I were a litigious man. But during the course of this show, the thing is, I was a little tiny blip on a podcast that spent an hour really defaming and really slandering in a major way a guy with a lot more money and a lot more power and a much more litigious nature than I'll ever have. So as I listened to this guy crapping on me on this podcast, I thought, I should be really angry. I'm not. I can't figure out why. I'm definitely not going to retaliate because this is obviously a plea for attention. This is, there is nothing sadder than a war between 2 middle-aged podcasters. I'm just not going to stoop that low. Not with this guy, not with anybody. But it was surprising. It was a whole panel, couple of whom I sort of consider myself to be friends with, several of whom I'm still friends with across all these social networks, and one of whom I've never met. And so I already wasn't going to comment on him because even though he was speaking about me, we've never met. We've never spoken. We've never interacted. We have nothing in common. There's been no interaction ever. So I was already determined to not mention him. And then they go back to him and go, so tell us more about yourself. And he goes, well, I've got such and such syndrome. My dick doesn't work. So what am I going to do? Am I going to strike back and punch down? No. Am I going to call attention to these people and name them? Absolutely not. Is it amusing when 2 dumb idiots who haven't seen each other in 20 years take swipes at one another on a podcast? Yes. So I'm embarrassed to have even been mentioned. I'm frankly embarrassed to have even responded to the degree that I have. But that is the end. There will be no podcast wars. Not if I have my way anyway. Plus, there's a lot of real stuff going on today, stuff that really matters. First of all, so sad, such a talented guy. Stephen Hillenburg. If that name doesn't mean anything to you, go watch the credits on an episode or a movie featuring SpongeBob SquarePants. He was created by Stephen Hillenburg, a brilliant animator, artist, writer, director, and producer, and he died yesterday at the age of 57 from ALS, which he was diagnosed with only in March of 2017. So, life is short and things matter. Caring about people matters, being with them when you have the chance to. It's like, I didn't have time for hate to begin with. I certainly don't have it now. Today, I'm feeling mostly sad, and not because a couple people called me an asshole on a podcast. If that is the least offensive thing said about me on a podcast today, that's fine. The fact that these people, I consider them friends, whatever. Seriously, it really doesn't matter. In the scheme of things, nothing puts life in perspective like an incredibly talented human being extinguished at such a young age. That's what matters. Also, for what it's worth, I don't think this podcast has a great many listeners, but to the extent that they do, one of the people on this panel said, "Oh, tell us more about this Matt Sager." And the guy said, "Oh, well, he was on K-Rock from years X through Y. He was on Q104 from years A through C. Then he went on to MTV and did Celebrity Deathmatch." And I was like, oh, this is a free plug. Of course I'm not angry. But it was weird. It's always weird when once you're past the age of 40, you get into silly altercations with anybody, especially with someone you consider to be a friend, but weird is where I draw the line. It was not actually upsetting. Although this guy who I declined to do a podcast with is clearly very upset with me and clearly holds a grudge. And for that, I'm sad, but I remain of the opinion that it would have been a terrible idea to move forward with the show. And that this podcast, in which he's still nursing a grudge, only underscores that point. I'd also like to say, talking about life and death and things that matter, today, November 27th, 1942, was the day Jimi Hendrix was born. Full name, James Marshall Hendrix. So today, he would have been a sprightly 76-year-old, undoubtedly still churning out amazing rock classics. Sadly, he's a member of the 28 Club, that of those legendary musicians who died before they reached 30. And my God, such a talent. A guy who I was exposed to at such a young age that it became very difficult for me. There's a pattern throughout my life in which someone turns me on to something so incredible, so just pure, raw genius, that I become jaded immediately. And so I miss out on a lot of other good things in life because I hear Jimi Hendrix before I hear pretty much any other guitarist. So the first several times I heard Eric Clapton, I was like, yeah, all right. It wasn't really until I got really deep into being a mod and loving The Who and watching Pete Townsend do his thing that I was like, all right, I get it. There are guitarists of every stripe, shape, genre, size. I get it. Jimi Hendrix was a god among men, but there are other gods among men. But Jimi Hendrix was a truly unique talent, one that obviously we're never going to see again. Ditto Stephen Hillenburg. So my message today, above all, well, first of all, don't upload corrupted files to your podcast server. That would be my number one lesson. But really, the lesson of today is love the people in your life, or don't have them in your life. There's just no time for anything else. Also, I'm sure you've heard me go on ad nauseum on recent episodes of the Matt Sager podcast about the streaming landscape and how it's getting ready to really ramp up, how there will be streaming services from and for just about every demographic, genre. And when I said that last, I wasn't even yet aware of a Fox News product called Fox Nation, which launched today for, I believe, Roku, Apple TV, probably the Amazon Fire TV, whatever dumb stick you're using to watch that dumb channel. And it is most definitively, it's aimed at what they call Fox News superfans. Now, the thing about journalism, this is very hard to remember in these days in which, Trump has such a problem with journalists who comment on him truthfully that the journalists are forced to make themselves part of the story. But the whole thing about being a journalist is you're not supposed to have super fans. You're not supposed to be involved in the story in any way. You are there to report the news, not to describe it as you feel your fans wish it was, not to make yourself a star. But this is what Fox Nation, the Fox News service for super fans, has on offer. The service, which is going to be, I think, it's $5.99 a month, has 4 categories, just like Jeopardy, keeping it real simple. Patriotic, of course, history, politics, and military. Everything that Fox News gets terribly wrong all the time. So, of course, those would be the categories that dominate Fox Nation. Greg Jarrett's The Russia Hoax. It's already establishing itself as a very fair and balanced streaming network. Let's see, Brian Kilmeade's What Made America Great? I wonder, was it segregated lunch counters? I'm going to go with yes for Fox Nation. There is apparently a tab where you can go and look at all the shows which include a documentary called Scandalous, with topics which include Chappaquiddick. Under patriotic, you can see One Nation Under God, because of course patriotism and religion are the same thing. A documentary called Andrew Jackson, A Hero Under Fire. And 3 Days in January, which is described by The Week as a 2017 special program hosted by Brett Baer about the transfer of power from Dwight Eisenhower to John F. Kennedy. Under politics, you can find Clinton, 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 Clinton. If you like saying Crooked Hillary, you're going to want to toggle right on over to the Politics tab, where you can watch such exciting content as The Tangled Clinton Web, or you could go over to Military and watch 13 Hours in Benghazi. Forget about what's going on in Charlottesville. Forget about Pittsburgh. Benghazi is still a big thing. So weird, these alternate realities. But it gets weirder. You know, you think of Fox as being this sort of, it's difficult to separate them from the president because he speaks every night with Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity made this big show of saying, listen, I'm going to campaign with Trump before the midterms as an interviewer, but I'm certainly not going to do anything like get on stage and co-host a rally with him. And I remember at the time thinking, wow, the standards for journalism have really plummeted since I went to school for this. But then, of course, he lied and he jumped on stage with Trump anyway. So the idea that Fox News is doing anything other than carrying water for our president is rather silly. But other networks do exist, and that's a problem for President Trump. So he's got a proposed solution. He would like state-run TV, our own worldwide network, he says. This, of course, right on the heels of having to give Jim Acosta his press pass back. Jim Acosta of the failing fake news CNN. Please don't take me seriously, and please don't take the president seriously either, because we just got over these frickin' pipe bomb lunatics going after people that Trump attacks. But yes, one thing that does get his base really riled up, and I mean that for him in a good way, gets them really siding with him, gets them thinking of him as an oppressed underdog, surrounded by swamp monsters and a deep state that's all about undermining his wonderful, historically great presidency. You've got channels like CNN and MSNBC that report on stuff like, let's see, Paul Manafort apparently after his plea deal was caught lying and is going to prison after all. That's fake news, obviously. This new climate report that basically says sometime in the next 30 years, we're just going to be eaten by the sun and we're making it worse every day. And here's a few things we could do to prolong our existence a little bit. That is 100% fake news comprised of data by scientists in the Trump administration. So it can be very confusing at times. So it might be advantageous to have a simple, streamlined worldwide network in which the president comes out and says, everything is perfect. Things have never been better and never will be better. Oh, and by the way, this is another thing he said today. You might have heard my episode last week in which he gave the Medal of Freedom posthumously to Elvis Presley and said, I was there. People were going crazy. And they said, Elvis has left the house. That's what they said. Elvis left the house. So yeah, just as accurately, he said that growing up and still to this day. He said, I shouldn't say this because you're going to think I'm boastful, which I'm not. Which, of course, is being boastful, but fine. Let's keep playing word games. Everyone always told me and continue to tell me that if you weren't blonde, you'd be a dead ringer for Elvis Presley. And I've got a number of thoughts on that, but mostly I think it's utter bullshit. But something that would dominate, for instance, a state-run U.S. network under this administration. Listen, if you want to hear all about it, it's only $5.99 a month for Fox Nation. And for what it's worth, I do have many friends who love Fox News. I don't understand the appeal. I find it to be largely propaganda. I've got a couple of friends who work there, one of whom reports news, straight up news, and takes a lot of flack for it. I do not know why he stays. I appreciate it, but it is an odd situation over there. So there's a lot of other things I wanted to get to tonight, but mostly my point is this. Just look to the person to your left, look at the person to your right, look at your pets. I'm looking at Iggy right now, my wonderful sweet cat. I'll probably make Iggy and Bowie the thumbnail of today, because every day I look at them and just appreciate how much I love them and how lucky I am to have them in my life. And I didn't have such sappy feelings about these people on this podcast who kind of took a great big shit all over me. But I think that feeling anything else, other than to joke about it, as obviously I'm quite comfortable doing, I do not have the energy that I'm willing to allot to a feud. Certainly not to a podcast feud. If this was hip hop, I'm sure I'd be taking it much more seriously. But a war between podcasters, middle-aged men, sitting at their desktops, recording into their computers, it is difficult to imagine anything more pathetic. So if this is going to be a war, it's going to be a one-sided one. Feel free to call me out, name me on any of your shows, say horrific stuff about me. I mean, if it's bad enough, if I gotta sue you, I will, but nor do I feel, and I'm sorry if this is petty, but for their sake, every bit as much as mine. I'm not going to name them. Because I did sort of just belittle them a little bit because I thought they were being rather silly. And life's too short. Silliness is great. Pettiness, not so much. Anyway, welcome to the week, and thank you so much for spending it with me. I value you and our time together, and I hope you do the same. You can get in touch with the Matt Sager Podcast. Email matt@mattsager.com or call 646-535-4788. Also, please hit me up on social media. On Twitter, I'm @MattSager. On Instagram, I'm Real Matt Sager. And on Facebook, I'm The Matt Sager. I've also got a voiceover page there, Matt Sager VO. This podcast, of course, has a page, Matt Sager Podcast. And look in the description for tonight's podcast episode for links to my new merch store and, of course, my Patreon. I'd love for you to check both out, see the various rewards and merchandise I've got on offer, and contact me if you got suggestions for more. I'd love to offer all kinds of stuff for you. And for the rest, more episodes of this podcast, my voiceover reels and contact information, blog posts, articles, and more, you can go to mattsagervoiceover.com.